Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I just got done interviewing my next guest, and I wanted it to go on and on and on. And I thought I was being called for jury duty because I got my summons, and then I called in just to confirm that I am indeed on jury duty, and lo and behold, I didn't get called in. They said our group wasn't called. So I had to wrap up the interview quickly. So at the end, you'll hear me say, jury duty, I've got to go. I so wish I knew that I didn't have jury duty because I would have kept talking. She is definitely going to come back for another episode. It is filled with so much research and wisdom. Everybody should listen to this podcast, whether you have a chronic illness or any health issues, or you don't have any health issues, or you know somebody in your life has some health issues. There's some struggles there. This is the birthplace of understanding how the epigenetics of chronic illness gets turned on or doesn't get turned on. She backs up what she's saying with research after research after research, study, articles. She is versed and so knowledgeable in this and how the body heals itself. And I will have her back to kind of keep going and break down more about how we heal ourselves. And I can tell you, just doing this work, it's nurturing yourself. It's loving yourself. It's loving. I know that sounds so cliche. So please know it's a lot more than that. And consult your medical doctor if you need more on addressing a chronic illness. If you struggle with anything or a loved one struggles with chronic illness, please listen to this episode. And if not, please listen to it in its entirety because she kept dropping more and more and more wisdom as we talked. So you might want to listen to this episode several times. This maybe even bring up something personally that you had never thought about. And I encourage you to journal about it, bring it up with your therapist, go to therapy, really dive into the research, read some of the books and articles she shares with us on this episode. So let me introduce you to the guest. I'm getting so excited that I haven't even introduced you to the guest. Veronique Mead is a former assistant professor of family medicine who retrained as a somatic trauma therapist. She writes about the research on how trauma is an under-recognized risk factor for chronic illness and why it's not in your head. Oh, when she said that, I was like, yes, it's not in your head on her blog, chronicillnesstraumastudies.com. chronicillnesstraumastudies.com. Her work also draws from personal experience of gradual improvement from debilitating chronic illness by addressing and healing trauma from nervous system perspectives. She is a consultant for health professionals and people living with chronic illness and offers a ton of free resources and ebooks and fact sheets on chronic illness and trauma connection on her blog. So Chronic Illness Trauma Studies is her blog. You'll definitely want to get on there. If you've had asthma, any kind of blood pressure issues, diabetes, she talks a lot about diabetes. Please listen to this episode. Go on her website and I will have her back. And if you want to get the journal as you're on your own journey, grab it for free at kristendboyce.com/free resources. It's always in the show notes too. If you want to get it there, just click on the link in the show notes. I just want you to know I am so grateful for you listening to this podcast, sharing it with people. I want to elevate these types of conversations. The one I had today, I'm like, can we get this out even further in the world? And you help do that. So if you share it on social, feel free to tag me on Instagram, Facebook at kristendboyce.com. Or if you're on LinkedIn, Kristen Boyce, wherever you are, feel free to share because I would love to help people find answers in research and healing information. And you're the reason I keep doing this. I know I keep saying that. So you matter, you're important, and I'm so grateful for you. So without further ado, here is my talk with Veronique, which I love her name, Mead. So here it is. Enjoy. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I am so excited to talk about this topic. It's a topic we have not fully dived into on the podcast. We talk a lot about the body and how trauma lives in the body and the body keeps the score, but we haven't really dove deeply into chronic illness as it connects to trauma and what we've gone through. So I'm really excited to have our guest on today, and I want to make sure I pronounce your name correctly, because my brain has brain blips and want to make sure I get it right, because people say my name incorrectly and I'm like, oh, it's fine. I respond to anything, but I want to make sure I get it right. Veronique, did I?
Yes.
Yay! Okay. Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, Kristen.
Oh, it's so great you're here. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself and then how you got into somatic work and chronic illness.
I used to be a family doctor. I was an assistant professor in a family practice residency program in New Hampshire, and I had long wanted to be a doctor. And while I was there, I ended up developing my own chronic illness, but I had no idea at the time that the levels of fatigue I was having were anything other than stress related. It was a really big, full-time, huge hours kind of job and definitely a lot of stress. But on parallel, while I was doing my own personal internal work at the time, but I was also realizing that I felt as though with my medical training, I was offering Band-Aids. That's really mostly what I seem to have to offer. We have a lot of depth in medicine, but there was a feeling that there was a deeper way to make sense of symptoms, maybe. I mean, I certainly have a lot more clarity now, 25 years later, looking back at how I was thinking about it. But something was calling to me where I felt I really wanted to approach it differently. And so I ended up taking a year off, and one morning waking up and realizing, oh, how about a somatic therapy program? And so I ended up doing a master's degree in how to listen to the body. That's really how I thought about it, was what's the intelligence in symptoms? And how do we explore that and respect that and use what they have to say to maybe improve things, whatever direction that was? And I thought with that perspective that leaving medicine would have cured my fatigue. And instead, I got worse steadily for probably 10 years, even as I started working on things. But I ended up in a program at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, that really focused on the somatic piece. And I was writing a paper one day and I was looking for an example. And generally, psychotherapy is dealing with mental health. That's how we see this in our sort of our medical model culture. And in looking for an example, I thought, oh, what if this pattern, this cycle that they're talking about with the body, what if it was happening in our physiology? What if there was a block or a stuck place happening with blood pressure, for example, where you're in a trauma cycle and your system gets caught at a particular place in that cycle where our blood pressure normally goes up for walking up the stairs, if we're jogging, if we're sitting up, it adjusts all day long. But what if it was getting stuck in a survival pattern? And that is what launched me into a whole level of exploration of things I never knew about or learned in medicine.
I think when you say medicine, we're not even treating what's underneath, right? We're not really looking at the body's giving us information. And what is the body trying to tell us? When we say somatic, because I know what that means, but let's say someone listening is like, what does that mean exactly? How would you explain somaticism or somatic? You went therapy, or how would you explain that to somebody?
The way I think of it now is anything that includes the body or incorporates the body in therapy, such as being curious about sensation. Is there tingling? Is there heat? Is there a part while we're exploring that feels numb? Instead of just staying in the head or just approaching something cognitively, which, I mean, that's a huge resource for me, the cognitive piece. But there's a perspective out there, and I've learned it through my own personal experience as well, that you can't actually work through trauma cognitively. You can't think your way through things that have happened that have been embedded in the nervous system through how our brain perceives things. You can't actually talk your way out of that. And so somatics will incorporate impulse. What's the impulse? Your system, your body. It could be a cognitive impulse. I want something, but what's in the want and where do you feel it in your body? Is it in your chest? Is there something in your gut? And also in the trauma work with the somatic piece, when you're working through trauma, you can track things in your own system as the therapist and in the client's system with how it resonates in your own. So, for example, when you work through trauma, if you work through a piece, let's say there's a place where you've been stuck and you haven't known how to move through a conflict with your boss or your partner, and suddenly you get an aha. Oh, if I say no to this, I've been trained, I grew up learning that I shouldn't say no. I mean, my own pattern is being a good girl and a people pleaser, right? That's a huge survival strategy in this culture. And what if instead you say no or you set a boundary? And if you're doing this in a somatic session, what happens from that? Like even right now talking about it, I have tingling in my body. It has a quality that's either neutral or in this case, kind of pleasurable tingling. I feel it in my arms. I feel kind of an excitement with that tingling. And when you're working through trauma and you actually are successful in accessing a fight or a flight or even a social nervous system, a conversation or a verbal boundary that succeeds where in the past, in some event, you couldn't, there's often this concept of what we call discharge. There's a lot of energy stored in the body that suddenly starts to move. It's been held back, maybe numb. Usually we don't even know it's there because it's so quiet or numb. And it starts to move like in this way of tingling for some people some of the time. So now for example, I feel the tingling actually in my legs going down to my calves. And I also feel a little bit of warmth. So again, we're tracking a bit of sensation. And other components are also looking at imagery, for example. That can be a way to titrate or distance yourself a little bit from something that's been overwhelming in the past. So those are a few examples of how we work somatically.
That's very helpful. Let's say someone says, I feel really overwhelmed with my body, and maybe I've learned to disconnect from it or dissociate, go someplace else so I don't have to feel the intensity in my body. How do you work with that?
Really gently and with a lot of curiosity, because disconnecting is another way that many of us have survived circumstances that were really difficult. It could be a long time in childhood of parents or not having parents that weren't really able to be supportive or where there was threat in that relationship, for example. So starting with that premise of symptoms as intelligent, one place to go with would not be to try to get someone in their body or try to get them to relax as the first or second thing you do. It might actually be curious. Oh, how do you know you're disconnected? How do you notice that? What's it feel like? And I know for myself, I've had chronic fatigue, disabling fatigue for 25 years. I'm doing much better, but I still have symptoms. This concept, when I explored that as the client in therapy, there was one day where it was like, oh, what does your system want to do in this state that we might call dissociated? And I ended up just looking outside the window at the sky, and the relief to not have to show up, to not have to be anything that you aren't, to not have to be in any state that you're not in. That can also relate to childhood and having had to be a certain way for safety or to make sure you got the attention for safety or care. So that moment of allowing your system or the client's system to be where it is and be curious about it, it's so rich with information. And so you can then go from there, because often if you give it some space and some time, and then you as the therapist are also there, so there's something new and different in this. Some we might refer to it as co-regulation, where my nervous system as a therapist is present and attuning and a witness, which for most people with chronic illness, they didn't get that in childhood. And that often goes to multi-generational trauma. Their parents didn't get that, and it can go back quite a ways. So if you can hang out there with this additional presence that's not judging of the therapist, and where both of you can get curious, it might be that you then find your system taking a breath. And that's often also an indicator in a somatic approach with that breath, that there's a shift happening in the nervous system that's settling a little bit, going in that direction as opposed to going into activation. And as you explore that, it may be that you explore that over many sessions. It may be that you just spend 10 minutes there in that particular day. It's very interesting to then see where the system wants to go next. It might actually come back into connection because it was given the space that maybe it never had. Or it might come into connection with you as the therapist. So there's a lot of places our systems want to go. And how do we make space for that? And also recognize, okay, where's the direction that we're going here? And do I need to steer it a bit one way or steer it another gently?
Yes, the breath is a window into so much. Talk to us about the breath and it being a window.
Oh my. I've noticed in my own, of course, as therapists, we're often really compelled to look at our own stuff and use what we're learning with ourselves, which I think is really helpful for working with clients. And I would notice if I was putting makeup on, for example, leaning forward into the mirror and doing something that was very, very detailed, that I'd be holding my breath, which is actually very stabilizing. It stops your body from moving with the breath. But I was holding it to such an extent that I was able to link that, oh, I just had an energy dip. And then it opens up into more curiosity about what might be going on in the bigger picture, because fatigue became my baseline for a long time. And the not breathing very much or very deeply, it can be an indication, a sympathetic arousal of fight, flight, of fear, of anxiety, where you're really kind of gasp of holding still and looking around or preparing. But it could also be freeze. And we don't talk as much about freeze in psychotherapy, even in trauma therapy a lot. So getting a full breath, sometimes my whole system has so much energy being put into not mobilizing, not being visible, holding back. And so for me, that breath can actually get stuck where I actually can't take a full breath. And I've learned over the years of paying attention to sensation that my diaphragm will often just clamp down. I didn't even know what it was that made it so that I couldn't take a deep breath over time. So tracking the breath could lead to a next layer of self-protection, survival energy that's not conscious, that's in your physiology, it's in your body, and where your body will hold in certain ways, in certain places. And you're nodding. I'm sure you see that in your work all the time too.
Okay, we're going to practice our breathing, and they're like, it's barely a breath.
Yeah. And taking a breath, there's a lot of sensation when you take a full breath, and you're really occupying more space in your body. And in chronic illness, the body is often not a safe place. So working somatically with chronic illness and trauma, you really do want to be very, very gentle and really want to be very curious. And so if the diaphragm's a little bit tight, you can have curiosity just very gently. So that breath, how does it feel to take that little bit of breath? Because that might be bigger than what they normally take. And it could easily stimulate anxiety to take up more space in your body or to feel your body, because it's harbored and held so much overwhelm and trauma, really. And that's how I have come to see it.
Thank you for putting it that way, because I think that's helpful to hear it that way, because people don't understand what chronic illness and the connection to the breath and the body. On your website, I was perusing it. It was very helpful, lots of helpful information. You had said 70 to 90% of chronic illness is not a causation like genetically, which we have been pretty conditioned to believe that it's genetics. And as therapists, we can see it otherwise, but a lot of people don't know that. Can you talk about that piece?
Yeah, that is Rappaport, I believe, is the article, the person, the reference for that. And there may be genetic risk underlying for most of us that determines at some level which chronic illness we develop. That's certainly something that they're learning. In type 1 diabetes, for example, there's often an underlying genetic component, but there's been an epidemic in the autoimmune form of diabetes for a few decades now. And they're at the point where the people who are developing type 1 diabetes are less genetically susceptible. Like it's occurring in a new group of people that are not the ones who are genetically predisposed. That said, this concept in medicine, and I always felt this way too until I started learning differently. In medicine, we think that if you have a chronic illness, it's very likely genetically based, at least if it's the kind of chronic illness with a name and a diagnosis and objective symptoms that a doctor can actually diagnose, as opposed to the kind that many people have that's said to be all in your head. Either way, the underlying genetic predisposition may never be accessed. Sort of the next level we've learned is epigenetics, which most of your listeners will have heard about. But the epigenetic component is something on top of the gene, that's where the epi comes from, that influences whether those genes get turned on or off, whether they're active or not. And a little mini digression, we have epigenetic changes going on all day long. So with food, eating, digestion, for example, when you feel hungry, there are certain genetics that are being turned on or off to get things ready to eat or make you feel hungry. And then you eat, you feel sated or not, and then you start to digest. There's a whole other shift of things that get turned on and off. So there's certain proteins and enzymes that will do the digestion. So there's an ongoing cycle all day long. It's kind of like with the blood pressure that we talked about earlier. Your body is adjusting moment to moment to moment to its environment. So to come back, for many people, those genes that may predispose them to a certain autoimmune disease or type 2 diabetes or whatever it is that they may be more susceptible to may never get turned on if their environment is really the supportive environment that their system can be with, as opposed to that 70 to 90% is what is influencing those genes to turn on or off. And that's anything environmental, which includes, we talk about pollution, we talk about very concrete things from a medical perspective in the environment. We know that asbestos is a risk factor for lung diseases. We know that there are carcinogens. Those are environmental factors, but not everyone exposed develops those conditions. And what's been left out a lot in the consideration of what is environment is life experience, and specifically trauma or adversity. And we have all kinds of research that it influences us through generations. Rachel Yehuda, who's a really big researcher in the field of multi-generational trauma, studied not just Holocaust survivors, but their kids and how their kids are more sensitive to stress, not just anxiety, but at a physiological, genetic, epigenetic level than kids whose parents did not go through the Holocaust. And so that's one whole area, just one area of study about the role of the environment. And I can say more, but your face looks like you have a big question.
Oh, no, I was just taking it all in because I think this is such an important conversation to have. So I'm just like into it. I'm into what this research you're unpacking and discovering. Can you expand on if someone says, well, I don't know what environmental factors I had and I have it. I have a chronic illness.
Yes. There's a couple ways I approach that when this is new information for someone. And one of the most common, if someone is actually considering therapy, it's usually because they have some sense that there may have been adversity in their past. And the most common is that it was a trigger for the onset of their illness. So for many people, the year before their illness, the weeks or months or year before their illness, there have been one or more pretty significant events. It may have been an accident. It may have been the loss of a loved one. It may have been that they were caregivers for someone, and this past year was just the hardest. Or maybe there's a really major struggle for their kid or someone in their family that they're going through. Maybe it was surgery. And that is usually, we often think if we have a chronic illness that was the cause. Infection is really common. Many chronic illnesses, 50% of the time, the onset trigger is an infection. But what I find really interesting is it's not a particular infection. People now often are getting, there's a lot of people who have long COVID now.
Yes.
And it's not about the severity of the COVID experience that they had. It could have been very mild. But also in type 1 diabetes, for example, or in multiple sclerosis, all kinds of different infections can be the onset trigger. So it begs the question of, was it really the cause, or might it have been the last straw? And one of the things that's interesting in chronic illness, if you look at autoimmune diseases, often the research is kind of in silos. So there's a group of people who research multiple sclerosis, and then there's another different group of people who research type 1 diabetes, and then there's somebody else looking at lupus. And each of these, there's research finding that the antibodies linked to a particular autoimmune disease appear to arise often quite a long time before the disease symptoms actually begin. So it could be 7 years. That's one of the studies in lupus. It could be 5 or 10 or 13 years in type 1 diabetes, and I think longer. There's even recent studies in Parkinson's disease, which we don't think of as an autoimmune disease, but that there have been antibodies identified and that those show up for a long period before. So in my looking into the research about chronic illness, I found this really interesting because we don't tend to think about chronic illness as having had a long period underlying where it's been brewing potentially. And there's a movement, I would think of it as that, a movement right now about inflammation, and that if we can detect higher inflammation, that might help predict someone at risk, and that you can then work with dietary changes and exercise and lifestyle changes to reduce that inflammation. But my question remains, why? Why is there that inflammation? And in the medical culture, and when you Google your chronic illness, most of the time, the conversation is about lifestyle. And what essentially have we done to cause our chronic illness with our bad lifestyle habits? This is especially true with anyone in a larger body and type 2 diabetes, for example. I find really interesting that's missing from the picture is that we've known since World War II research. David Barker initiated some of this research in Europe after World War II, and it's called The Developmental Origins of Adult Health and Disease, DOAD. It's also been known as FOAD, Fetal Origins of Adult Disease. What David Barker, an internist, found was that people who were born small, that would be, most of the studies that I know of have been done on people who are white, Caucasian, and that for us, the normal birth weight is about 7 pounds. Babies under that, maybe 6 pounds further under that, are at higher risk, he found, when he followed them into adulthood, for diseases of insulin resistance. And those are known as metabolic syndrome X, type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and high body weight. And he found that this continued to the next generation. And we've seen studies in mice, in animals. It can continue for many, many generations. And you never see this. If you Google type 2 diabetes, whatever major health website you see, it's really primarily focused on lifestyle and that you need to lose weight. It does not talk about this major body of research. This is not just one researcher. There's a really excellent article by Calkins, published in 2011, I believe, Calkins. She's a pediatrician. I believe she's a co-author. It's a really long paper. It summarizes all that research. There are books written about this topic, and you never hear it. You don't hear it as a person who's part of the general population. You don't hear it as someone with a chronic illness. There's an older book by, I believe it's Peter Gluckman, also on this DOAD. And a smaller birth size is not necessarily what causes or leads to a higher risk of insulin resistance, because not everybody who's small birth weight develops a chronic illness. It's more of an indicator, and it's an indicator of prenatal stress. And the World War II studies that David Barker did was actually, they first started looking at was a population who had been under siege in Holland during what's known as the Dutch hunger winter. And so there was starvation. And that's where they looked at, okay, small birth weight is influenced by malnutrition. And the focus has come back to it still being primarily looking at maternal nutrition. But we have an increasing risk of chronic illness here in the US. Maternal malnutrition is not, I don't think, the most common issue here in this country, even if we have an imbalance in what people have as far as whether it's poverty, economic security. But really, it's an indication of prenatal stress. And that prenatal stress could be malnutrition. But imagine if you're starving under siege for however long, you're going to have experienced a lot of emotional stress. And very likely it's not just stressful, it was traumatic. You didn't know if you were going to survive. So this research has been repeated in all kinds of settings. And prenatal stress, it's really painful and difficult to hear this as a parent, especially as a mother, because there is so much stress in our culture. But there are so many ways to mitigate stress. And when there's enough support, or there's additional research saying that's just the first phase, it seems that a child would require additional adversity after birth to actually put those survival patterns into play and to increase the risk for chronic illness later on. So being a low birth weight does not mean you will develop a chronic illness, but if you have a chronic illness and you were low birth weight, it can raise the question, what was happening for my mother? What was happening for my parents? What kind of support was happening during their relationship at that time? And from there, with just this one lens, you can really start to explore a lot of what might have been going on when your nervous system, your physiology, your biology was being shaped and developed. And it's kind of flabbergasting in a way that we don't think about this in medicine. But a lot of people know, like if you're a gardener or if you like planting a few annuals, if you put those flowers in a pot and they're the kind of flowers that like shade, like impatience, and you stick them in the full sun, that's an environmental condition that's really difficult for a shade-loving plant. And if you go back to growing the seedlings for these plants, if you grow a sun-loving plant in too much shade, you get a really long, tall, skinny, scraggly plant. That's because you're influencing development at a really important part of its early life structure, and that influences the cells and the cell structure and everything that gets laid down. So this is a really under-recognized risk factor for all kinds of chronic diseases. And I would say from what I've looked at, the research in type 1 diabetes has probably been the most comprehensive, looking at the role of trauma and early adversity. There's a study they did called the ABIS study, the All Babies in Southern Sweden, I think it is. It was published, I believe, around 2015, and they started this study with 10,000 babies born in this study. These were not babies at genetic risk. They just took a population, and I think they asked everyone who was having their babies, will you be part of this study? 10,000 babies, and they followed them for 14 years. The babies who had antibodies that are related to risk for type 1 diabetes, some of them had them, I believe, at birth. I can't remember in this moment if it was at birth or in toddlerhood or if they did both. I'm pretty sure they did both. And babies whose mothers had experienced domestic violence. And there was one other traumatic thing they were looking at. I don't remember which one it was. But those babies had had 3 times more exposure to that kind of trauma in the womb compared to the babies in this group of 10,000 who did not have antibodies for type 1. And then they looked at them at the toddlerhood, and they looked at them at 3 or 4 time periods. And they looked at a number of difficult events, including, say, the loss of a grandparent, which really affects the parents, which really then affects their capacity to be present because of their own grief and trauma. And what they found in these 14 years, there were a few things. One, the kids who'd ended up developing type 1 diabetes had had 3 times more adverse events in their childhoods compared to those who hadn't, which is really a mirror of those kids who had antibodies at birth or in toddlerhood who had themselves experienced 3 times more at levels of adversity. What they also found, and this isn't very commonly talked about either, is that having the antibodies does not mean you will progress to type 1 diabetes or whatever chronic illness it is. Those antibodies in some kids, they regressed and resolved completely. So there's a lot more fluidity in our understanding of chronic illness. So it may be that we are getting more familiar with the role of trauma, but there's so many protectors that can be built in also. And ultimately, this is probably a big component of your podcast. If we as adults do our own work, I'm not a parent, but I'm still walking around in the world and how I interact in the world. But if parents especially can have the support to work through their own trauma, to recognize their own trauma, and you were talking about this yourself in one of your Myths of Trauma podcasts, the more we can work on our own trauma to begin to resolve this, there's all kinds of things that happen. You can actually reverse the epigenetic changes that turn some genes on or off to cause symptoms. We know that babies' epigenetics actually mirror their mother's epigenetics. This is the work of Michelle Wright. I think she might be out of Yale, WRIGHT. And there's a fascinating story with Tony Madrid, who's a psychologist in California, who's published a lot of papers with really small studies, 10, 15 kids with asthma and their parents. And he discovered this by accident. But what he discovered was kids with asthma have experienced 3 times more adversity than the kids, their counterparts of the same age who have not developed asthma. And a lot of that is adversity that happened for the mother during pregnancy, labor, or in the first few years of their kids' lives. And what he accidentally discovered is that when he works with the mother and he helps her repair the traumas that happened for her during pregnancy, labor, birth, and in those first few years, her child's asthma either improves or goes away. It's mind-boggling. And I spent years trying to understand, is there anything in the literature that can help us understand this as something other than woo-woo accidental stuff? And first of all, Tony's been doing this for 30 years with the same results. And the kids who respond best are the youngest. They're 9 years or under. And the kids who respond the quickest and the fullest, they might be a year old or 2 years old, but complete reversal, including in 9 years old sometimes. His theory, and I would agree, or one theory is that after 9, it gets harder because that child starts to accumulate their own adversity experience on top of what might have happened earlier. But this work by Michelle Wright, that the baby's epigenetics mirrors the mother's. And Rachel Yehuda, who I mentioned earlier, who's a big researcher in multi-generational trauma, has found, she has also done a lot of work with veterans. And when you have veterans who are able to recover or improve from PTSD, what she's found is that they have epigenetic patterns that are reversed. So we know that epigenetics can be reversed. We know that babies may be mirroring their mother's epigenetics. We also know, this is the work of Michael Meany out of McGill and Moshe Schiff, I'm not pronouncing his name right, probably, but they published a landmark paper in 2004. The lead author is Weaver, Weaver. What they looked at was, can maternal behavior, not maternal genetics, maternal behavior influence epigenetics in babies? And they looked at rats, and they had discovered that there are rat mothers who are more nurturing in that they lick and groom their little pups more. And they even arch their back so that it's easier to access for nursing. So they looked at rat pups that were raised by the more nurturing dams compared to the less nurturing dams. And they found that there were epigenetic differences in the rat pups' brains and in their stress response and their cortisol responses. 2 other things. They found that this only happened if they were exposed to this environment of the mother during a certain period of time. I believe it's like week 1 for 1 week. And rats age differently than humans, so our own time frame would be a longer period, but this is known as a sensitive period, or it's a window, like the breath is a window. Our development has windows of time when our pancreas is developing, or our nervous system, which is developing the whole time, but there's very specific windows of time during development. So if they're exposed to a more versus less nurturing dam during this one particular week, they have epigenetic changes, and the pups with less nurturing are much more sensitive to stress, and it can last throughout their lives, this is so important. How do we nurture our next generations? The other thing that they found, point two, is that if they cross fostered the rat pups, if they switched the pups with a less nurturing dam to a more nurturing dam, guess what? The epigenetics reversed. And those rat pups were not the more sensitive to stress rat pups. So this is like Tony's work. There is so much more reversibility than we're aware of, and so many indicators of stress, for example. Yes. Yeah. So if we can catch indicators of stress in babies, so what if you have a chronic illness as an adult, and as a baby, you know that you were really difficult to console. Either you maybe cried a lot, or maybe you were super quiet. Super quiet could be at the freeze end of the spectrum, which we don't think about. But it could be that you were a colicky baby. It could be that you woke up a lot as if you were having night terrors or some kind of nightmares. These are just a few indicators. And on the side of the baby and on the side of the parent, what Tony Madrid found with the kids with asthma, the very first mother, when he discovered this by accident, was when the mother told him she was doing therapy. They tried everything for her 9-year-old daughter's asthma in his psychological practice. They'd done family therapy, they'd done imagery, they'd done relaxation therapy. And I call her Jillian. Her asthma would improve for a short time and then it would come back. And she was on a lot of meds, inhalers, steroid bursts, often in the emergency room. So it indicators of fairly severe asthma. So when none of that worked, the mom ended up continuing therapy for a while. And one day she said to Tony, she says, I feel terrible saying this, but I don't feel love for my daughter. I'm doing what I know I should be doing, but boy, I'm supposed to have this feeling of love, but I don't. So Tony had worked with her by first asking what had happened during pregnancy and labor and birth. And there were things like, and I don't remember if this was specific for her case, but he has a lot of cases in his publications. Things like financial stress was major. The dad left during the pregnancy. When she was in the hospital, the nursing staff was really not just unsupportive, but they kind of harangued her. Her mother was in the delivery room with her, and her mother was really difficult. So very low support and adversity. But it didn't stop there. When she was born, I think Jillian she may have had jaundice. And so she was taken away and put in an incubator or under lights just for a day or two. And again, I'm mixing up which story is which, but the very common is that there's been an interruption, and it's an interruption to bonding. This very innate thing that we have can get displaced. So if we have a lot of fear or overwhelm or grief, it can be very difficult, or if you feel really unsafe, or if you worry about your baby because they have something that might be really common and really normal. And then if you're not just emotional separation because of these emotions, but then if you on top of it have physical separation, which is very common, and it's been very common for decades. We're much, much better now. But for those of us who are adults in our 40s, 50s, 60s, that was not the case when we were born.
No.
So a lot of us have experienced bonding disruptions.
This has been so incredibly helpful. I could talk to you for hours. I could literally talk to you for hours. You are so filled with so much wealth of information and research in everything you're saying. I'm like, yes, yes. I just want to keep talking and keep going. Unfortunately, I have jury duty. So jury duty is calling. This has been amazing. Where can people find you if they want to know more about you and your work?
Place is my blog, and that's called Chronic Illness Trauma Studies. chronicillnesstraumastudies.com. And I've got all kinds of free resources there, free ebooks. I talk about the babyhood and childhood adversity, and also write about chronic illnesses for adults with a lot of specific blog posts with some of the research on that.
Everybody needs to go to our website. I was on there for at least an hour perusing all of your content. I was like, I could just be doing this for days. It's so helpful. And thank you for elevating this conversation. I'd love to have you back because I feel like we just kind of tipped the iceberg at some point to dive even more deeper. into chronic illness and how to work with it and nurture it. And that's really what I want to do. So I'd love to have you back. Thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world. I am so grateful for you and your heart and your time and your work.
Thanks so much for this invitation, and it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for letting me share so much of this information, Kristen.
I'd love it so much. Thank you a million times over.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, Boice.com. Thanks and have a great day.